There's a sound that used to come from a shelf in the dark, a metallic clack, 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 steady as a heartbeat, and then a screech that didn't belong to anything in nature. If you were a kid anywhere in America between the 1950s and the 1980s, there's a decent chance one of these things lived in your house, sitting on a dresser, tucked in a toy chest, staring. This is the story of the Jolly Chimp, the cymbal-banging monkey that millions of parents bought as a harmless gift, and that millions of kids quietly decided was the most terrifying object in the building. It didn't arrive with a warning. It arrived in a box with a smiling photo on the front, sold next to wind-up robots and tin cars, the same aisle as everything else considered perfectly normal for a child's bedroom. Nobody on the shelf at Woolworth's flagged it as anything other than a novelty. And for a few seconds after you flipped the switch, it really was just that. A toy monkey clapping cymbals, doing exactly what the box promised. The trouble started a few seconds after that. The story starts in Japan, in the early 1950s, with a company called Daishin. CK Toy manufacturing in post-war Japan was a different business than it is today. The country was rebuilding its industrial base almost from scratch, much of it under American occupation oversight, and small toy makers became one of the early export success stories, turning out tin novelties cheaply enough to ship across the Pacific and still undercut anything being made domestically in the United States. Materials were scarce, factories were improvised, and tin was one of the few things still cheap and available, often literally recycled from flattened food cans, the printed labels sometimes still faintly visible on the inside of the metal before it got folded into a chest cavity or a foot. Daishin took that tin, a simple wind-up or battery mechanism, and a monkey-shaped plastic face, and built something nobody had quite seen before. They called it the musical Jolly Chimp. The mechanism itself was almost embarrassingly simple, which is part of why it could be built so cheaply and sold so widely. Inside the chest sat a small motor, geared to two arms holding miniature cymbals. Flip the switch on its back, and the arms swing together in a steady rhythm, clack, 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 over and over, with no variation, no pause, nothing that resembled the randomness of a living thing. That rhythmic perfection is part of what made it unsettling. Real animals don't move like that. Machines do. And something shaped like an animal, moving like a machine, sits in a place in the human brain that doesn't have a comfortable label. Researchers who study this effect call it the uncanny valley, a dip in comfort that happens specifically when something looks almost, but not quite, alive. A teddy bear doesn't trigger it because nobody mistakes it for breathing. A toy monkey with a human-like face and mechanically perfect motion sits right in the middle of that valley, and it sat there decades before anyone had a name for the phenomenon. Then there was the head, on the classic Daishin version. Pressing down on the top of the chimp's skull triggered a second mechanism entirely, a separate circuit hidden from the cymbal-banging motion. The lips peeled back, the teeth showed, small and even and slightly too white. The eyes, sitting on small internal plungers, physically bulged forward out of the sockets, while the toy let out an electronic screech that sounded less like a monkey and more like something dying, something caught in a trap, somewhere just on the edge of human. Then, after a few seconds, it would calm back down, the eyes receding, the teeth disappearing behind the lips, and it would return to its cymbals like nothing had happened, like it was waiting to be touched again. There was no ramp-up, no warning sound before the scream. 1 second normal, the next second not, and that unpredictability inside a toy that was otherwise so mechanically predictable is exactly what made it stick in people's memory for 50, 60 years afterward. Daishin manufactured the musical Jolly Chimp for roughly 3 decades, from the 1950s through the 1970s, dressed in a yellow vest with red buttons and red and white striped pants, a green tag stitched to its arm. But the design didn't stay exclusive for long, because nothing that sells this well in mid-century toy manufacturing ever does. Once it proved it could move units, other companies in Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the United States started building their own versions, some licensed, plenty not. Kuramochi Shoten and the Yano Man Toy Company released their own variations. Yano Man's Peppy the Tumbling Monkey, adding acrobatic flips to the formula. A toy distributor in South San Francisco named Louis Galoob reintroduced a battery-powered cymbal monkey in 1957 as one of his very first products, years before Galoob ever became the company behind Micro Machines or the Game Genie. In New York, a Japanese-built version called Jolly Chimp was sold directly off folding tables by street peddlers in Lower Manhattan through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, the same blocks where knockoff watches and umbrellas got hawked to tourists. The chimp clanging away on the pavement to draw a crowd before anyone had said a word about it. And it worked, commercially, for decades, in a way that's almost hard to picture now in a toy market dominated by licensed characters and branded franchises. Cheap to produce, visually loud, mechanically simple enough to survive rough handling and the inevitable drop down a flight of stairs, the cymbal monkey became one of the most reliably sold novelty toys in the mid-century toy aisle. It didn't need a TV commercial campaign or a tie-in to a cartoon. The cymbals did the selling on their own. Stand one up in a store window, let it run, and a crowd of kids would form within a minute, pressed against the glass, daring each other to go inside and ask to see the one that screamed. What almost nobody making or selling these toys seemed to plan for, or even think about, was the psychological undertow sitting quietly underneath the whole design. Monkeys, more than almost any other animal, sit close enough to human in shape and expression that our brains process them differently than a toy dog or a toy bird. Primatologists have long noted that humans react to primate faces with a kind of heightened scrutiny, looking for the same emotional signals we read on each other. Add a face frozen in a permanent, slightly deranged grin. Add eyes that don't blink, don't track, and occasionally bulge straight out of the skull on command. Add a sound that mimics distress without actually being distress, a scream divorced from any real pain behind it. None of that registers as funny to a developing nervous system alone in a dark bedroom at 9 o'clock at night. It registers as wrong, in a way that's difficult to articulate at age 7, but very easy to remember at age 40. By the 1970s, the chimp had quietly become something bigger than a toy. It became shorthand, a visual cue that storytellers in film and television could rely on without explanation. Horror and science fiction directors noticed that simply placing one of these things in a child's bedroom, in frame, doing nothing but sitting there, created tension without a single line of dialogue. It shows up in the opening minutes of Rebel Without a Cause in 1955. Years before it had any horror reputation at all, simply as a piece of ordinary set decoration. It appears in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977. Animated and clattering, in a scene meant to unsettle long before the aliens ever show up. It turns up in the Jim Carrey version of How the Grinch Stole Christmas in 2000, and again in Toy Story 3 in 2010, where Pixar leaned directly into decades of accumulated cultural dread around the prop. Stephen King wrote it directly into a short story simply titled The Monkey, where the toy becomes something closer to a curse than a plaything, banging its cymbals to announce a death every time it activates on its own. None of these appearances were coincidences. Filmmakers had figured out what generations of kids already knew instinctively. This thing photographs like a threat, and audiences don't need to be told why. The toy never got banned. There was no recall, no congressional hearing, no regulation written specifically against it the way later toy safety laws would target lead paint or small detachable parts. It simply aged out, the way a lot of mid-century novelty toys did, as manufacturing shifted toward licensed characters, video games, and the rising cost of producing tin and simple wind-up or battery mechanisms compared to cheaper plastic injection molding overseas. Daishin's original run faded through the late 1970s as the company's tooling aged and competitors undercut its price. Other manufacturers kept variations alive into the 1980s and beyond under different names: Jolly Chimp, Magic Monkey, Jolly Chimp with the extra E, Peppy the Tumbling Monkey, each one a slightly different face stitched onto the same basic idea, each one quietly less common on store shelves with every passing decade, until eventually most American kids encountered the design only secondhand through a parent's attic box or a fleet market table, rather than a store shelf. Here's the part that's easy to miss if you only remember the fear. For a lot of kids, the chimp wasn't purely a nightmare. It was a dare. Maybe the first real dare a lot of 7-year-olds ever took. You'd sit across the room from it on the carpet, work up the nerve over the course of several long minutes, creep forward on your knees, and press the top of its head just to feel that jolt of adrenaline when the eyes popped and the screech started. Then you'd scramble backward laughing, heart pounding, daring your little brother or your cousin or whoever was closest to go next. It taught an entire generation something that's harder to find in a toy today: a controlled, repeatable dose of fear you could trigger and stop yourself on your own terms by simply backing away or flipping a switch. No screen, no algorithm deciding when the scare would hit, no autoplay queuing up the next clip before you'd recovered from the last one. Just you, the monkey, and your own thumb hovering over the switch, deciding when you were ready to feel that drop in your stomach again. Today, original Daishin units in good working condition sell to collectors for upward of $100, sometimes considerably more for examples with intact fur, undamaged cymbal arms, and the original green arm tag still attached. Tin toy collectors and mid-century novelty enthusiasts still trade them at flea markets, estate sales, and online auctions, partly out of straightforward nostalgia, partly because almost nothing manufactured today moves or sounds quite like they did. Built from real metal rather than injection-molded plastic, with a mechanical screech that no modern speaker chip quite replicates. Toy historians point to the design as one of the clearest examples in 20th century manufacturing of a product succeeding commercially, almost in spite of, or perhaps partly because of, the exact quality that should have killed it on a focus group table. No modern toy safety reviewer would let this design anywhere near a shelf today without a redesign of the eyes, a softened scream, a warning label about sudden loud noise. We made childhood safer and quieter, and a lot less likely to physically startle a 7-year-old awake at 2 in the morning over absolutely nothing. Somewhere in that trade, we also lost a very specific, very strange kind of bravery test that an entire generation grew up daring each other, and themselves, to take. There's also a simpler, more practical reason this toy ended up in so many American living rooms that has nothing to do with fear at all, and everything to do with what parents in the 1950s and 60s were actually shopping for: a mechanical, self-contained toy that required no reading, no rules, no supervision, and that visibly did something the moment you turned it on, was close to ideal for the marketing logic of the era. Television advertising to children was still in its infancy. Word of mouth and in-store demonstration sold toys. A monkey that clanged its own cymbals in a store window did the demonstrating for free, all day, without a salesperson standing next to it. Parents weren't buying a horror prop. They were buying the cheapest, loudest, most self-evidently entertaining object on the shelf, the toy equivalent of a gift that explains itself the second the box comes open on Christmas morning. That gap between intent and outcome is part of what makes this story interesting decades later. Nobody at Daishin sat in a design meeting in 1953 trying to manufacture dread. They were trying to manufacture motion, noise, and a price point low enough to move volume. The creepiness was a byproduct, an accident of biology meeting a limited engineering toolkit, the same way a handful of other mid-century novelties accidentally wandered into the same territory. Ventriloquist dolls with their too wide painted smiles, mechanical fortune tellers in glass cabinets at the boardwalk with their slow, jerky head turns. None of them were designed to disturb anyone. They were designed to be cheap, mechanical, and eye-catching, and disturbance just happened to live in the same neighborhood as those three qualities every single time. By the late 1980s, the chimp had fully crossed over from toy aisle to horror trope, helped along by George Romero's 1988 film Monkey Shines, which leaned hard into the unsettling potential of a primate that seems just a little too aware of what it's doing. Around the same period, home video was putting decades of old film and television clips back in front of a generation that had grown up with the actual toy on their dresser. And the two memories, the literal childhood object and its on-screen horror movie cousin, started to merge in the cultural imagination. By the time the internet arrived, with message boards and early listicles devoted to ranking the creepiest toys of the 20th century, the Jolly Chimp wasn't just a contender. It was usually the toy other unsettling toys got compared against, the baseline measurement for mechanical childhood dread that everything else got held up to. It's worth sitting for a moment on just how ordinary the toy looked sitting in a catalog page next to everything else available that same year. Page after page of dolls, building sets, board games, and somewhere in the middle of it, a small photograph of a monkey in a vest holding two tiny cymbals, captioned with nothing more dramatic than its price and a line about batteries not included. There was no warning copy, no age restriction beyond the standard small parts disclaimer, nothing in the marketing that hinted at what happened the first time a kid pressed down on its head in a dark room. That contrast between the flat, harmless catalog description and the very real reaction the toy produced in practice says something about how differently toy companies thought about a child's emotional experience compared to how toy safety regulators think about it today. Loud was fine, mechanical was fine. Whether something looked like it might be alive, and whether that mattered to a 7-year-old's nervous system, simply wasn't a line item on anyone's checklist. If you ever had one of these on a shelf in your room, if you remember the sound of those cymbals coming from somewhere else in the house when you thought nobody else was home, drop it in the comments. There are more of you out there than you think.